Your role no longer adds value, Damien said, his voice smooth enough to make the cruelty sound professional. Most people imagine yelling or chaos in a moment like that, but for me, it was the stillness, the kind that settles right before a structure gives way. I walked out of that office knowing he thought he'd erased me with a signature. What he didn't realize was that his decision unlocked something he never saw coming, something already shifting quietly beneath his feet. If you've ever been blindsided at work, subscribe and tell me what moment changed everything for you. When I first stepped into Skyport Freight Systems 10 years ago, the place felt nothing like the corporate maze it would eventually become. Back then, the floors still echoed with ambition instead of fear, and I threw myself into the work because it felt like building something real, something that mattered. I wasn't chasing titles or applause. I wanted to keep the heartbeat of our freight network steady, even on the nights when storms clawed across the Rockies and every route felt on the brink of collapse. Those early years were made of long evenings hunched over distribution maps, recalculating cargo flows while the cleaning crew vacuumed around my feet. There was a strange kind of comfort in being the person the team reached for whenever a hub froze or a winter surge pushed our limits. I didn't mind being the quiet constant. Responsibility never scared me. Indifference did. And back then, no one was indifferent. Not to the work, not to each other. People stayed late without being asked, brought each other soup during flu season, and celebrated every on-time delivery like we'd won a championship. It felt honest. It felt earned. Somewhere along the way, that sense of belonging turned into something deeper. I felt protective of the system I'd been entrusted with, not because anyone told me to be, but because it held pieces of my life in it. Meals skipped during emergencies, birthday calls answered from server rooms, weekends surrendered to seasonal chaos. Those sacrifices weren't burdens. They were proof that I was part of something bigger than myself. And maybe that's why the foundation cracks so quietly. When you care that deeply, you don't notice the first signs. Not when they're small, not when they hide behind spreadsheets and slogans. You tell yourself the long hours will pay off. That commitment still matters in a place built on grit. You believe people see your contribution even when they stop saying it out loud. What I didn't understand then was this. Loyalty becomes invisible the moment leadership stops valuing the people holding everything together. Still, during those first years, Skyport felt like a place where effort meant security, where showing up in the worst conditions meant someone would show up for you in return. The unspoken agreement was simple. Do the work, carry the weight, and you'll have a place here. And I carried it all piece by piece through outages, expansions, failed vendor rollouts, and sleepless holiday cycles. I carried it because I believed it mattered. I carried it because no one else knew the system the way I did, not in the way that lives inside your bones. Even now, looking back, I don't regret those years. The work shaped me, sharpened me, forced me to grow in ways comfort never could. What I regret is assuming that the company I built stability for would offer the same in return. That belief would be the first part of me Skyport tested, and the last part they expected to break. The first real fracture in the world I thought I understood appeared the day Damien Holt walked through Skyport's doors with that polished smile executives practice in the mirror. People whispered that the board loved his transformational mindset, but even before he spoke, I felt the temperature in the building drop. He carried himself like someone who believed efficiency wasn't a strategy, but a personality trait, one he assumed the rest of us lacked. I watched him shake hands with directors he'd never met, offering the kind of compliments that sounded memorized, not meant. What struck me most was how quickly he assessed the room, not for strengths or experience, but for threats. It was in the way his eyes lingered too long on anyone over 50, or anyone who'd been there longer than he'd been out of grad school. I'd seen leaders who didn't understand our systems before, but Damien was something different. He didn't want to understand them. He wanted to replace the people who did. In the weeks that followed, he moved across departments like a cold front. Entire teams were restructured with the explanation that we needed to modernize our operating philosophy, which sounded impressive until you realized it meant eliminating the stability that kept our freight network functioning. Longtime managers were replaced with consultants who treated our infrastructure like a puzzle they could solve on a whiteboard. You could feel the unease spreading, especially among those of us who had built the operations he was now dissecting. Conversations in the break room became quieter, punctuated by glances toward closed doors where strategy sessions took place without the people who actually knew the strategy. And the part that stung wasn't the exclusion. It was the assumption that our experience was obsolete. I felt that shift personally the first time Damien toured my section. Instead of asking how we maintain throughput during weather disruptions, he wanted to know what cutting legacy process owners would do for our quarterly numbers. His questions weren't curious, they were hunting for justification. Something in his expression told me he had already decided whose roles were legacy, and mine wasn't the only one on the list. What unsettled me wasn't the threat itself, but the speed at which he dismissed the very foundation of Skyport's operations. He acted as though systems that took years to refine were minor obstacles to his vision. I'd been ignored before, but being treated like an inefficient statistic felt different, colder, calculated. The board praised his boldness, calling him a visionary. Meanwhile, the rest of us watched as the company's pulse changed rhythm, each beat more forced than the last. Meetings that used to center on solving real problems suddenly revolved around slides filled with buzzwords. Departments that once collaborated now competed for survival. For the first time in a decade, I felt like my work existed on a fault line. There were moments when I tried to convince myself that maybe this was simply a transition period, turbulence before stability. But every time I saw Damien walking through the building with that same confident stride, surrounded by people who echoed his language without understanding it, something inside me tightened. Not fear yet, but awareness, a knowing, the kind that creeps in slowly like a quiet warning you don't want to acknowledge. Still, nothing prepared me for the way he looked at me during our first formal meeting. A glance that wasn't curious or respectful, but appraising, as if he were deciding whether I was an asset worth keeping or just another outdated component he could discard. That single look told me more about Skyport's future than any strategy document. It told me who this man intended to be, and it told me exactly who he planned to erase to prove it. The first real sign that something was shifting beneath my feet came wrapped in the kind of subtlety only corporate danger knows how to use. It wasn't dramatic or loud, it was a tiny glitch in my badge one Tuesday morning, the scanner lighting up red before finally turning green on the third swipe. I laughed it off at the time, blaming the reader, but a small thread of unease tugged at me. That thread tightened each time it happened again. Twice more that week, then once the next. It dismissed it as a system sync issue, but the timing felt too deliberate to ignore. Still, I told myself not to jump to conclusions. People my age learn to doubt their instincts in the workplace because experience gets mislabeled as paranoia, but instincts have a way of resurfacing when patterns repeat. The next pattern arrived silently. Meetings I'd been invited to for years suddenly vanished from my calendar. Decisions about network throughput or seasonal adjustments moved forward without my input, and when I asked for updates, I was told they were still aligning stakeholders. That phrase usually meant someone wanted my responsibilities without my presence. A colder realization settled in the pit of my stomach. I wasn't being consulted, I was being circled. Then came the consultants, the ones Damien hired from firms that believed observation made them experts. They walked through my department with clipboards, not speaking to anyone, jotting notes like anthropologists, studying a species they didn't respect. Once I caught one of them staring straight at my workload metrics on the operations dashboard. Instead of asking me what the numbers meant, he whispered something to his colleague and kept writing. That was when the uneasiness thickened into something heavier. I'd spent a decade refining those systems, and now strangers were dissecting them without understanding the first thing about their architecture. The worst part wasn't what they did. It was the deliberate silence around it. Silence is its own language in corporate spaces. It tells you when a room you once belonged in has already begun closing its doors. The whispers started shortly after. A friend in accounting mentioned, casually, like she wasn't terrified to even say it, that Damien had been reviewing high-cost legacy roles. She didn't use my name, but she didn't have to. Legacy had become his favorite word for anyone who'd been around before him. 2 days later, HR accidentally CC'd me on a calendar invite titled Role Consolidation Review Reduction Candidates. My name wasn't listed, but the meeting title alone was enough for my pulse to skip. When I pointed out the mistake, HR apologized with a cheerful tone so rehearsed it felt like another warning. Even then, some stubborn part of me tried to rationalize everything. Maybe it was restructuring. Maybe it was just an oversight. Maybe I was reading too much into it. People like me who have survived layoffs and reorganizations always hope loyalty will outweigh politics. But the body feels danger before the mind admits it, and mine was screaming. The final confirmation wasn't a glitch or a whisper. It was the sudden shift in how leadership looked at me. Not hostile, not dismissive, just expectant, like they were waiting for something to happen to me rather than with me. Even in casual interactions, I could sense the distance growing, a quiet separation that made every hallway feel narrower. You don't stay at a company for 10 years without learning how to read the air, and the air around me had turned thin. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was that every one of these small warnings was preparing me for the moment Damien would reveal his real agenda. The moment when subtlety would fall away and the attack would finally arrive in plain sight. The day it happened had that strange, heavy stillness that settles in right before a storm breaks, the kind that makes even ordinary moments feel like warnings. I had been planning to leave a little early, maybe pick up dinner on the way home, and try to shake off the unease that had been trailing me for weeks. But at 4:32 p.m., Damien's assistant appeared beside my desk with her voice clipped a little too tight, her posture a little too rigid. "The CEO would like to see you, now." She tried to keep her expression neutral, but her eyes flicked away from mine as though holding them too long might expose something she wasn't supposed to feel. That was the moment my heartbeat changed. When you've worked somewhere as long as I had, you learn the difference between ordinary summons and the kind that carry consequences. This one felt like an ending before I even stood up. His office was too bright when I walked in, the overhead lights reflecting off the glass walls like a stage set for something unpleasant. Damien didn't stand. He didn't greet me. He didn't gesture for me to sit. He looked at me the way someone looks at a file they've already decided to delete. "Ariel," he said, exhaling as if even my name was an inconvenience. "I'll keep this brief." I stayed standing, not out of defiance, but out of instinct. Something in me sensed that sitting would give him the upper hand he was eager to claim. He steepled his fingers the way executives do when they want to appear reasonable. "Your position has been evaluated," he continued, his tone coated with that artificial calm people use when they're proud of their own cruelty. "And your role is no longer essential to Skyport's direction." The words didn't land all at once. They spread outward slowly, like a bruise forming beneath the skin. "Effective immediately," he added, watching me closely, waiting for the shock or panic he expected to see. Instead, something inside me went still, not numb, clear. "We appreciate your past contributions," he said next, delivering the line with the same sincerity someone might use while discarding an empty cup. "But we need to streamline operations. Your responsibilities will be transitioned to external resources." External resources. Consultants who didn't understand our freight flow, contractors who had never weathered a winter surge or rebuilt a failing hub at 3 in the morning. The arrogance of it nearly made me laugh, but the moment was too sharp, too exposed to waste breath on disbelief. He pushed a paper across the desk, a termination letter already printed, already signed. He had prepared everything before I ever walked into the room. "HR will follow up within the hour," he said. "Your access has already been disabled." That last part was meant to puncture whatever pride he thought I had left, but it only revealed how little he understood the systems he was claiming control over. He expected a reaction, pleading, anger, confusion, but my silence unsettled him. I could see it in the slight twitch of his jaw. It bothered him that I didn't give him the performance he'd rehearsed this moment for. I felt the shift the moment it happened, the exact second he realized he wasn't in control of my response. "Thank you," I said quietly, not as gratitude, as a marker. A note for myself that this was the point things would begin to change. His expression soured. He preferred victims who cried or begged, People like me disrupted the narrative he crafted about himself. At 4:47 p.m., I stepped out of his office with a cardboard box and the hollow echo of fluorescent lights buzzing above me. Security met me halfway down the hall. Malik didn't look at me at first, but when he finally did, there was something in his expression I hadn't seen in a long time inside Skyport. Respect. The walk to the exit felt surreal, not because I was being escorted, but because the building felt different, as if I were seeing its decay for the first time in full light. I wasn't being removed for performance. I wasn't being removed for misconduct. I was being erased because a man who didn't understand the architecture of the company wanted to prove he could reshape it without the people who built it. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that by firing me in the most humiliating way he could conceive, he hadn't cut me out of Skyport's future. He had cut Skyport out of its own. Sitting in my car after the escort, I didn't start the engine right away. The keys hung from the ignition, untouched, while the emptiness inside me settled into something sharper than shock, but steadier than rage. In that quiet space, the truth of what had just happened didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a shift, the kind that rearranges the air before you even notice you're breathing differently. When I finally picked up my phone, there was only one person I trusted to make sense of the moment. Sabrina Keene, my attorney, the woman who had built my contract with the precision of a surgeon, and the foresight of someone who had seen too many good employees discarded by men who believed themselves untouchable. She answered on the second ring. "Ariel," she said, not surprised, not gentle, just ready. "Tell me exactly what he did." I gave her the details, the wording, the timing, the pre-printed letter, the lie about my access being cut. She listened without interrupting, the sound of papers shifting faintly on her desk. When I finished, she exhaled slowly. "He triggered it," she murmured. "Triggered what?" The silence on the line wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. "Your licensing clause," she said. "The proprietary integration terms we negotiated when Skyport brought you on full-time." My grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Sabrina, explain." She spoke carefully, the way she always did when the truth had sharp edges. "The AirGrid throughput engine you built, the original framework existed before Skyport hired you. You owned it. They only licensed it," she continued, "and that license is explicitly tied to your active employment. The moment your job ends, the license dissolves automatically." The words landed with a clarity that cut through every lingering thread of humiliation. "Meaning," she added, "as of 4:47 p.m., Skyport is using your framework without legal permission." I didn't feel triumphant, not even relieved. What I felt was a sudden realignment, like the ground I'd been standing on had tilted in my favor without warning. "Does Damien know this?" I asked. "If he did," she said, "he never would have fired you." She told me to document everything, the exact minute he announced the termination, the presence of security, the conditions under which I left. "And do not answer any calls from Skyport tonight," she warned. "They will discover the mistake quickly. Let them sit with it." So I did. I sat in the darkening parking lot as the city lights flickered on, holding the phone in my lap while the weight of her words settled into something immovable. The framework I had built, 10 years of refinement, thousands of decisions made under pressure, solutions crafted from instincts Skyport never understood, was no longer theirs to touch, not legally, not operationally, and Damien had severed the only thread that allowed them to use it. The first call came from an unknown extension at 7:58 p.m., then another at 8:11, HR at 8:17, the operations director at 8:26. I let them ring into silence. Every vibration of my phone felt like confirmation, not of revenge, but of inevitability. By the time Sabrina called the next morning, Skyport had already begun to feel the consequences. "Emergency board meeting," she said. "They're scrambling." I imagined the conference room, the long glass table, the screens flickering with error reports, the investors watching Damien stumble through excuses. And somewhere between Sabrina's steady voice and the frantic messages piling up on my lock screen, the realization settled fully. Damien hadn't taken anything from me. He had unlocked something I never would have used against Skyport, something only his arrogance could have unleashed. He thought firing me proved his authority. All it did was expose the limits of it. By the time the sun stretched through my blinds the next morning, Skyport had already tried calling 7 times. I didn't answer any of them. The silence wasn't spite, it was strategy. Sabrina had warned me the panic would escalate fast, but even she underestimated the pace at which Damien's carefully curated authority would unravel. At 8:03 a.m., her name lit up my screen. "It's happening," she said without greeting. "The board is in meltdown. Legal finally explained the clause to them." I pictured the room immediately. Polished table, stale air, faces draining of color as they realized that the backbone of their freight system, my air grid engine, no longer belonged to them. They had leaned so heavily on a structure, they didn't understand that they failed to notice they were sawing through the very beam holding their roof up. Sabrina continued, her voice sharper now. They asked Damien why he terminated the one person whose departure dismantled their operating license. He blamed HR, then analytics, then legacy inefficiencies. No one's buying it. A part of me wondered if he felt even a fraction of the humiliation he had tried to inflict on me. Another part didn't care enough to speculate. Skyport's chaos no longer belonged to me. My phone vibrated again, another call, this one from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail, but curiosity tugged. When I listened, the message surprised me. "Ariel, this is Rowan Blake from Aerochain Systems. We heard you might be between situations. I'd like to talk." His tone wasn't hurried or desperate. It was respectful, intentional. He didn't just want to hire me. He wanted to understand the mind behind the architecture everyone else took for granted. An hour later, he called again. This time, I answered. "Your work has been admired from afar for years," he said. "Skyport never understood what they had. We're expanding 2 new hubs this year. We want someone who sees the whole board, not just the pieces." The contrast between his voice and the frantic messages still flooding my phone was almost dizzying. Skyport wanted access. Aerochain wanted partnership. "What are you offering?" I asked. "Sector-exclusive licensing of your framework," he replied, "plus a senior role with authority that matches your expertise." He didn't give numbers, not yet, but he didn't have to. The difference between being valued and being needed is enormous, and Skyport needed me only because Damien had destroyed their safety net. Aerochain valued me because they recognized the blueprint of a system worth building on. Before I could respond, another call came through, this one from Skyport's CFO, Dana Mercer. I didn't pick up. She tried again and again. Eventually I answered, not out of courtesy, but clarity. "Ariel," she said, breathless, "the board has authorized a significant licensing payment. We want to resolve this immediately." "What's the offer?" I asked. "2 million, she said. The number hung between us like an apology made too late. "No," I replied. She hesitated. "We can negotiate." "Negotiation would have required respect before termination," I said. "You're responding to a fire you didn't expect. I'm responding to a future I've already chosen." I ended the call gently, not vindictively, but decisively. When Sabrina called again, she sounded almost stunned. "Ariel, they removed Damien from the investor call. On camera, they stripped his authority mid-sentence." I imagined the moment, the flicker of disbelief on his face, the investor's chat exploding in the background, his confidence collapsing under the weight of consequences he engineered himself. Not once did I feel joy. What I felt was finality, clean and deserved. Later that afternoon, I signed Aerochain's preliminary agreement. Strangely, the moment didn't feel like revenge. It felt like coming up for air after holding my breath for years. Skyport called 3 more times that night. I blocked every number. Their crisis was no longer my burden. Their downfall wasn't my victory. It was simply the truth catching up to the decisions they made at 4:47 p.m. In the weeks that followed, I kept waiting for the anger to surface, for the humiliation of that afternoon to rise back up and choke me the way Damien hoped it would. But instead, something quieter took its place. An understanding I hadn't been able to face while I was still inside Skyport. For the first time in a decade, I woke up without bracing myself for a crisis before my coffee. My mornings felt different, almost unfamiliar, as though I had stepped into a life that had been waiting for me to stop carrying weight that was never meant to be mine. At AeroChain, people listened when I spoke. Not because I had a title, not because they feared losing access to my framework, but because they genuinely wanted to understand the vision behind the systems I'd spent years refining. On my second day, Rowan asked me to walk their engineering team through my philosophy. Not the code, not the workflow charts, but the thinking that shaped them. No one at Skyport had ever asked for that. They wanted output, not insight. Efficiency, not understanding. Sitting in that room at AeroChain with people taking notes, not because they needed ammunition, but because they valued clarity, I finally felt the contrast between surviving and belonging. Skyport's unraveling made the news more than once. Missed delivery zones, routing failures, a failed rollout they blamed on unexpected technical challenges. Industry analysts speculated whether the company could recover from the operational instability, but I didn't follow the updates closely. I didn't need to. Their collapse wasn't my vindication, and watching it wouldn't restore the years of loyalty I'd poured into a place that decided I was dispensable. What mattered more was recognizing the truth I had avoided for far too long. The culture that allowed Damien to rise had been eroding long before he arrived. His arrogance wasn't an anomaly. It was the outcome of a system that valued appearance over substance, metrics over people, and speed over understanding. I carried that realization with me, not as bitterness, but as clarity. Losing my job didn't break me. It revealed what had already broken inside Skyport, and once I saw that, I stopped wondering whether I should have fought harder to stay. The truth is, some doors only close because the hallway ahead requires you to walk through something new. For years, I believed loyalty would protect me. I believed my dedication would be seen, that the nights spent stabilizing failing hubs or the weekends sacrificed to seasonal surges would mean something in the long run. But loyalty only matters in places capable of recognizing it. Skyport wasn't one of those places, not anymore. What I want people my age to hear is this: your worth isn't measured by a single company's inability to see you. You can give everything you have, your time, your brilliance, your commitment, and still be treated as replaceable by someone who learned your name last week. That isn't a reflection of your value. It's a reflection of their blindness. Walking out with a cardboard box in my hands felt like loss for a moment. But looking back, it was the first time in years that I wasn't carrying everyone else's expectations. It was the beginning of choosing myself. And if you've ever stood in a doorway like that, hurt, dismissed, uncertain, trust me, there are places waiting where your experience won't be seen as a cost. It will be seen as strength. I didn't understand how deeply a broken system could wound a person until the day I carried that cardboard box out of Skyport. The firing itself was humiliating, yes, but the real injury came from realizing the culture that allowed Damien to treat me that way had been building for years. It wasn't one man's arrogance. It was a leadership structure that rewarded detachment, punished experience, and mistook speed for competence. That realization didn't hit me like a flash of insight. It crept in the days after, when my phone kept buzzing with their panic, and I felt nothing but a hollow recognition that none of this had to happen. Skyport had every chance to value the people who held its systems together, but it chose shortcuts instead. And shortcuts always reveal what an organization truly believes. People are replaceable, expertise is optional, loyalty is a liability. Seeing that truth hurt more than the firing. It forced me to confront the years I spent believing stability came from showing up, working hard, and keeping the company alive through storms, literal and otherwise. But the flaw was never mine. The flaw was in a culture that confused familiarity with weakness and novelty with competence. Once I saw it clearly, something inside me finally settled. I stopped blaming myself for a system that failed long before I walked into that office at 4:47 p.m., and I learned that you can't fix a structure that's already decided you're part of the problem simply because you remind them of what used to work. How to get started today. Notice when leaders value noise more than knowledge. Pay attention to how people treat long-term employees during transitions. Keep private notes on patterns that don't feel right. Don't confuse cultural decay with personal failure. Give your energy to places that invest in understanding, not replacing. What part of this story echoes something you've lived through?